Very warm welcome, everybody, to this next lecture of our series, Stockholm plus 50, 5 Decades of Global Environmental Governance. The lecture today is about global water governance. Water issues were considered a problem of the Global South, mainly of the Global South, for a very long time. Only more recently, we've realized with climate change, we are increasingly aware of our limited freshwater resources also in Western countries, like in this region of Berlin-Brandenburg. My name is Lena Patsch. I'm professor of comparative politics at the Otto Suhr Institute of Political Science. And for me, it's a great honor and a pleasure to welcome Manuel Fischer from Eawag, from Switzerland, and he's also a professor at the University of Bern. I'm organizing this lecture series together with several students, including Felix, who is going to introduce Manuel Fischer before the floor is yours. You will have about 45 minutes then for your talk, followed by a Q&A session. The talk and the session will be recorded. Therefore, when you ask a question later on, please use the microphone. Okay, very warm welcome again, and Felix, you introduce Manuel.
So yeah, hello everyone. I'm very glad to see you. I have the pleasure to introduce Manuel Fischer, who came all the way from Switzerland to hold this lecture today, where he works in Switzerland at the Eawag, Swiss Interdisciplinary Institute for Aquatic Research. He started there as a postdoc in 2012, and since 2014, he's leading a research group on policy analysis and environmental governance. He is also at the same time, since the last year, an adjunct professor at the University of Bern at the Faculty of Political Science, but his main work is really at the Eawag Swiss Institute. He studied political science at the University of Geneva. He did his bachelor's and his master's there, and also his PhD, where he focused on political networks and decision-making processes, mostly at the national level. But now at Eawag, his focus is mostly on the local level, local administration, and particularly also the field of freshwater governance, which is what we're talking about today. And we also already conducted the interview with Manuel just now, and it was very interesting, and I can tell you that he has a lot to say about local governance and local administration. So if you have any question about that, feel free to ask afterwards. I'm sure a very good answer will be found. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Good. Welcome to this presentation. Thank you very much, Lena, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Lisa and Felix, also for hosting me here and doing the interesting interview and the talk. Felix just read my CV on a very little personal note. Actually, my mother was born here in Berlin. So it's also a very personal pleasure to be here and give a professional talk in that way. So I'm going to talk about sustainable development in water in the broad sense, and about cross-sectoral, transboundary, and multi-level governance arrangements. You'll hear in a minute of what I mean by them and why they are important. I also have to thank, of course, my co-authors on the book chapter and the broader research project that I'm taking the findings and the insights from. These are Paul, Julie, Javier, and Sofia at the University of Geneva and in Ecuador and in Bolivia. So this is a joint project that was funded by the St. Gallen University Leading House for a Latin American region. in order to fund joint projects between Swiss researchers and researchers from Latin America. And since we were both, with Paul, who's the main initiator of this joint project, we were both interested in water governance and environmental governance, we started to think about different kind of governance arrangements that I'm going to talk about today. I'll start with 2 interview quotes. So within this project on water governance, we have conducted interviews in Ecuador and Bolivia. I have not conducted them. I have not even conducted the ones in Switzerland. That was my colleague Julie. But I'll start with 2 of those quotes to give you some of the flavor of what we're going to talk about and how that actually is important to actors and practitioners on the local level, right? So here, one quote from an interview partner in Ecuador says, well, local governments perceive that the alignment of the SDGs with their local planning is an obligation. They do not have a real motivation to do this, but they rather fulfill a requirement for local management, which is crucial for their access to resources. So that says a little bit something about the interaction of this international level of global governance, where the Sustainable Development Goals, among those, there's also the one on water, right? They are defined on this international level, and they arrive to some degree on the local level and have some consequences there. But which ones is the question? And here you immediately see that there's also some tension. It's an obligation, but it's still important in terms of gaining access to resources. And so that shows some of these processes that are very complex and sometimes very indirect between the international level and the local level. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. There's an interview partner in Switzerland who has emphasized another aspect. She said, there is little contact between the division water and the division sustainable development, so of their local administrations, basically. Sustaining these contacts is difficult because our divisions are highly specialized. So there you see a very practical view of cross-sectoral interaction, right? We always talk about sustainable development as being this holistic entertainment of achieving several goals at the same time, looking for synergies. In reality, on the practitioner levels, that is much more complicated, right? And you can also see why. Because individual decisions of public administrations are there to be specialized. And that is almost a goal conflict with also at the same time talking to others who are specialized on a different thing. And so there's not only tensions, as the first quote said, between what is happening on the international level and the national and then the local levels, but there's also this complication of different substantive sectors talking to each other and actually looking for good governance solutions. Let's look at this from a little bit more systematic point of view. One of the issues, the latest one I was talking about, is what we in our chapter, in our work more generally call the challenge of cross-sectoral coordination. Right? I illustrate that with these 3 circles and the 3 pictures that go with it. They should represent 3 substantive problem areas where policymaking and governance is happening, right? On the hand side, in blue, you see a water ecosystem. On top, you see agriculture, right? And on the right-hand side, you see hydropower dams. And there's obviously goal conflicts again between managing these different issues. For a good ecosystem, for a healthy water ecosystem on the left, as at least it looks like from the picture, you need space. That space might be scarce because agriculture also needs space, right? If we need more space for producing food, there will be pressure on pristine ecosystems. The same or the similar dynamic is of course true with using water for hydropower, where healthy ecosystems are under threat because hydropower is one of the sources of clean energy in a way, right? I'm questioning the clean part of that, but it's often seen as such. And so coordinating the different goals between these areas, and there's many more, is highly complex. Not only because they have different goals of what they want to achieve, but also because these people that are working in these areas, they talk different languages. And that's a little bit what the quote before said, right? We're so specialized in their own area that you don't have the capacity to actually also take into account what is happening in other sectors. I'm going to talk about the SDGs later again. You could also see that in such a way, right? The different sustainable development goals, and here's the one, and I have chosen the ones that are somehow related to the picture that I had before, right? Clean water and sanitation on the one hand, zero hunger, and affordable and clean energy. These are goals that we have defined as a global community that we need to achieve and that we want to achieve, but there's important trade-offs between them, the ones that I just mentioned before. I'll get back to these SDG interactions, but you could basically also see the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals as suffering from this problem of choosing trade-offs and making hard decisions among the different goals. Now, on the other hand, there might also be synergies, and we're going to talk about the more positive aspect of maybe achieving synergies between these different goals later. So, the coordination between the different sectors, that's one of the main challenges, be it on the international level, on the national level, or on the local level of governance. There's another one. And I've chosen here a picture or a map of Switzerland. We're talking about transboundary coordination. So coordination of different policies across geographic areas, across countries, or here across cantons in Switzerland. They correspond to the Länder in Germany, more or less. So they have their own political systems, they have their own policies, but they share water resources. And of course, you also see the Lake Constance, which is all towards the south of Germany and all towards the north of Switzerland. You see it up there on the right, right? That is a water resource that is shared by 3 countries, actually, because Austria is also bordering there. And so there, what you have is again kind of a problem of fit, that the problem space, which is the lake, is given by basically by nature, and mankind has put administrative borders that complicate coordination for one single resource. That again is relevant on many different levels. Here what you see is so these different lines between the Swiss canton, that's then treaties of coordination that deal with water, with lakes and rivers as well. But you have a lot of these treaties on the international level. You have a lot of bilateral treaties that deal with the regulation of waters of fresh water, right? Lakes and rivers worldwide are dealt with by these kind of agreements, or joint commissions, or management plans. We'll see that later as well. So, a coordination between different administrative entities on the same level and across borders is a second challenge that sustainable governments needs to respond to. A third one is, and there's again an example from Switzerland, but what you can basically see is the country below, and then an individual region within that country that are again its own political system. So there you have multiple levels of decision making, and of course you can extend it to the international level, There's the European Union, which is an important level of decision making. There's the UN system, if you want, that has fewer competences, of course, than an entire political system, but sets a couple of principles and rules. And so there's these interactions between the different levels where relevant decisions about the resource are made. And there again, coordination to some degree is a challenge, because they're obviously talking about many very, very different scales of a specific problem. So what we have there are three, what I would suggest are kind of governance challenges. I call them here the challenges of sustainability governance, but you might even want to think about these challenges in any type of governance situation. Maybe that's not even that strongly related to sustainability, but if we want to achieve sustainable governance of any kind of resource, or if we want to achieve a sustainable development goal, then taking into account these different challenges and looking at how coordination can actually be achieved across these three dimensions is important. What we have done in the book chapter within this project, and what I will present now, is that we have tried to identify how these challenges actually appear in international principles of water and sustainable development treaties, let's say. And we have at the same time also looked at very local arrangements of governance and have tried to identify how these different aspects, how these different challenges actually appear. I'm first going to talk about the international level. So there's a set of international agreements that are important for defining principles of water management in the history of international law, if you want. Here are some examples that had the focus or the start of international principles on water can be seen as being given by the Dublin Statement in 92. And then there were additional international principles formulated. There were the United Nations Agenda 21, and the most recent one, and there's others in between, and the most recent one are then the Sustainable Development Goals as formulated by the United Nations in 2015, and since then being implemented, right? Now, the three elements that I mentioned before, those different coordination challenges, they all appear already within the Dublin Statement on water governance, right? What is emphasized there, on the one hand, is a focus on the whole water cycle. So water in all of its different states and the entire cycle of how water is actually used and how water flows through ecosystems, right? That brings about different types of uses and different types of claims to the resource. And they should all be considered when the resource use is governed. And also intersectoral needs were already emphasized at that time. So the different needs of different sectors related to the resource of water. The transboundary issue was also mentioned, mostly with respect to the international level. There was the importance, or the treaty, the document emphasized the importance of international cooperation for transboundary issues, for transboundary rivers and transboundary waters in general. And it addressed the issue of multi-level governance in a sense that it proposed to delegate the activities to the lowest appropriate levels. Now that is generally the principle of subsidiarity, right? That the lowest appropriate level actually deal with the problems that there are. In reality, of course, that is always a matter of negotiation of what the lowest appropriate level is, right? So it is said that the national levels and the international levels are there for coordination, but at what level exactly the action will be taken will always be a matter of negotiation. But here, the statement basically said that at least the lowest level should be considered as the appropriate one. So we see all of those, and we see them again in the most recent international document that is relevant for guiding principles on water governance. So the Sustainable Development Goals, where there's 17 different goals and water is one of them, right? And that per se, as I mentioned before, puts a focus on the fact that there's potential trade-offs between these different goals. So whereas the 92 Dublin Statement mentioned that there's intersectoral issues and pressures should be taken into account, here we're much more explicit by saying that there's the water goal, but there's 16 other goals, and they're all kind of within the same framework. So from the message here that is that we cannot deal with every individual resource on an individual basis and formulate the principles, right? We need a holistic agenda for sustainable development. And that puts much more emphasis on these potential trade-offs, but also on the synergies between these different goals. So that is, from that point of view, in my interpretation, kind of a qualitative step from dealing with issues on the international level in separate documents and formulating one holistic agenda. We are forced to think about the mutual influences also of these different sectors, if you like. The Agenda 2030, so these different sustainable development goals, they also, there's one aspect that kind of emphasizes the transboundary character. Of course, transboundary management is mentioned under the water goal, right, in details. But in more general, as a paradigm, what is emphasized with the Sustainable Development Goals is that the Agenda 2030 is only achieved if it is achieved in every single country, right? So it's not enough for Western countries to say, we're basically there. In my case, Switzerland, for a lot of the water targets, we can say we're there. We're still responsible for contributing to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, not least because the Western countries have some kind of external footprint, of course, on water use, right? But that puts, so that is, let's say, a dimension more. It's not about transboundary management of resources that are jointly shared, and where if I'm lying on the same river as Felix is, right, we have the interest of actually jointly managing that river. Here, it's on a higher dimension. The entire world, all the countries have the joint responsibility to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in all in the entire world. Now that is has a strong there's a strong normative claim to that, right? That goes beyond just transboundary management. And in terms of multi-level governance, in a way, there's this strong moral obligation of national and local implementation. There's also the process that is not exactly mandatory, but countries are asked to actually report about their degree of implementation. So there's the principles on the international level, and then the different appropriate levels within the countries themselves and regional authorities, but also non-state actors, are in a way, morally obliged to implement that. So again, there's this picture of a very holistic agenda towards sustainable development. And that is different from the heterogeneous treating of individual aspects in individual international arrangements. Right? So for me, that is really the qualitative difference of where we are now with the SDGs. Now, of course, that does not mean that they are implemented. A lot of people say we're never going to get there, right? And we're not at all on track with some of those, or even with most of those goals. But the way they're formulated in a holistic manner, that is important. I'm going to go into an example of interactions, as I mentioned before. So that is some work that we have done within an academic article. It has also been related to the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019. I think there's a newer one out now, if I'm right. But this was the one that emphasized very strongly these interactions between the different sustainable development goals. So again, we cannot work individually towards, for example, towards the water goal. We need to take into account all those interactions. Otherwise, we will not manage to implement the sustainable development goals. And then people have started to identify where those interactions are and how strong they are, right? What you can see here is kind of an overview of those different interactions. Now, don't try to read all the details, but basically what you see is on the vertical and the horizontal, you see the 17 goals. And then at the intersection of those goals, you see smaller or larger dots. The smaller dots means that there's supposed to be little interaction between achieving the one and the other goal. The larger the dot, the more important interactions there are. And then blue and red is kind of intuitive. Blue means synergies, and red means there's actually goal conflicts there. So for example, what you see, the yellow one, number 7, you don't even see the numbers, but it's saying there's the blue one, number 6, which is water, and then the yellow one is energy. And so if you look at the horizontal line of the energy goal, there's kind of a lot of trade-offs that need to be addressed. If you look at the water goal, just one above, right, the blue one, number 6 again, there's quite some interactions with other SDGs, but they tend to be rather synergistic. Now, it's obviously hard to assess this, right? This was done based on existing literature. There's other sources that could be used, and there's kind of a large amount of literature that has developed in the last couple of years of assessing those kind of interactions. Some of them have used expert interviews or surveys to have asked actually experts to judge those interactions, right? Some of them have looked at statistical indicators of development, if water has gotten cleaner over time, what has happened to energy, etc. So they have rather looked at past development and statistical indicators thereof. This assessment here is based on a coding of the literature. Now, you could obviously say it only shows what is actually assessed in the literature. So it basically also represents what researchers and practitioners and the reports that are written about these SDGs, what they are looking at, right? So there might be blind spots. Still, I guess it gives you some kind of an overview of where the most important synergies and trade-offs are. Another point here is, of course, an importance of context. This is a very general assessment of several hundred documents that have dealt with those interactions on many different levels, right? So there's kind of an average result that you see here. Those interactions can be very context sensitive. They can be very different on a global level than on a very local level. They can change over time. And so I'm just saying that because there's much more literature that deals with how these SDGs interact. But so the scientific community is trying to assess these trade-offs that should help implementing the SDGs in a holistic manner. Let's look at two of those. So the ones that appear in red, that's the intersection between SDG 6 and 13. That's also one of the focal interactions that we have in the book chapter. It's water and climate. You don't see a lot of difference, so it's basically blue, which means it's basically synergistic, right? If you do something to make water governance more sustainable, you also help to address climate change. It's stronger in the other way around. If you do work on climate, you also help water. So that what you could see the dot on the left lower hand is a bit larger than the one on top. So the influence on climate action on water is more important than vice versa. But again, I mentioned that before, right? You mostly see synergies there, so that's maybe something to work on, because with working on one of these aspects, you can actually also achieve another goal. But of course, other interactions are more important. Now the question is, should we mainly focus on those where there's important trade-offs? Should we mainly focus on those where there's really important and a lot of interactions? Because there, we can potentially also do a lot of damage. If we're doing the wrong things with respect to energy, then we can do a lot of damage with respect to the other goals. So we also need to be very careful there, right? So what exactly should be done? That answer is obviously not in that table. But the table and the literature more generally, or that focus on the synergies and the trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goals, it puts the focus again on this holistic implementation of a Sustainable Development Agenda, where water is just one aspect of. I guess I have made those, I have not specifically made those examples, right? So there's a couple of examples, of course, of how water and climate interact. So in general, increasing temperatures, right, due to climate change imply heavier stress on water resources worldwide. So again, that means if you work on one, you also work on the other, right? Also, strengthening adaptive capacity to climate change will reinforce access to drinkable and affordable water. And it emphasizes the importance of including climate change measures in water agreements. There's many different examples and elements of how the two actually can reinforce each other, right? Okay, so that was the international level. SDGs, their interactions, the importance of a holistic perspective on sustainable development versus a sectorial dealing with the water issue only. We have looked at very local governance arrangements. So that has basically nothing to do with the international agreements. And I'm emphasizing that because we should not assume that international agreements are just directly implemented. I've been talking about the implementation of these SDGs before, that the countries are responsible and the regions are responsible to take actions, and the non-governmental associations are responsible to take action. That is not happening automatically. And maybe a spoiler here in a way, if you talk to people on the ground in local governments, either they have not heard about the SDG language, they think it's even counterproductive because they have to formulate things in terms of SDG targets. They have never thought of that before. Or what they say is that they use it, as one of these quotes said at the beginning, right? They use it because they have to, because that's a way of tapping into money. But there's no natural implementation just because we have formulated the SDGs on the international level that all the actors on the local level are actually thinking in the same terms. I think the SDGs are very clearly creating a joint language on the international level, among international organizations, among academics. I don't think they're doing that on the local level. Maybe that's also not what we should expect, right? So we have looked a little bit into local governance arrangements in 3 different countries, which are, as you'll see, the countries of the research team, right? There's the Lake Titicaca region in Bolivia, there's the Mancomunidad de Bosque Seco in Ecuador, and there's the Lake Léman, Lake Geneva in Switzerland. So these are very different types of regions, right? Well, first in terms of economic development, in terms of the specific problems that they have. Sometimes it's water scarcity, sometimes it's water quality, sometimes it's water use for hydropower. They're all different from that point of view. They all are, to some degree, under the same pressure. It's mountain countries with melting glaciers, with changing precipitation regimes. And so the water management will change in the future, right? Climate change, mostly climate change, impacts on the availability of water resources in mountain regions. And that is kind of the common denominator. The other types of problems, they're all different across these different cases. As I mentioned before, we have done interviews in these cases, and we have studied documents to assess to what degree local arrangements take the 3 challenges that I have mentioned at the beginning, how they take these 3 challenges into account. And what you see here is that all of the 3 challenges, the cross-sectoral issues, the transboundary issues, and the multi-level issues, they are taken into account in plans, in committees, in working groups that are working in these regions, right? I'm not going to go into detail into any of the specific cases, not least because I was not the one who was working on these very specific cases. So there's just very little I can say about one specific case, right? I'm going to focus on some general patterns that we found. And the first one is really that all of these challenges are actually addressed at the local level to different degrees, but you can see all of them. What that means is that there's an institutional complexity in these local arrangements. With institutional complexity, I mean that there's, as I mentioned before, there's different plans, committees, working groups that are dealing with water-related issues, and some of them are more focusing on coordination between 2 countries. Some of them are more focusing on water quality and agricultural sector, right? Some of them are more focusing on integrating local communities into local decision making. So they all cover specific aspects of these challenges. There's not this one institution that covers all of these specific challenges. What that means is that the relevant actors that are there, the municipalities, the non-governmental organizations, the private industries, all the relevant actors that are there, they also have to choose where to participate and what issues to address, right? So there's certainly not this one solution in local governments on how to address these 3 different governance challenges. It's rather, and I'll come to that, it's rather bottom-up dynamics, historical developments of how things were managed in these local regions. The second thing that we observed through these interviews and the document analysis is a little bit what I mentioned before, right, with the spoiler there. There's little connection to international principles. So here, for example, to the Sustainable Development Goals. What that means is, first, what I mentioned before, we shouldn't just expect that as soon as international agreements are done, we also see a natural implementation on the local level. What it also means is that there's a lot of bottom-up dynamics that are happening independently of the international principles, right? A lot of these institutions that we see in the table behind, a lot of them have been established prior to international principles. People on the ground that are sharing waters across borders, they have seen the problem and have tried to address this, right? It's been somehow systematically formulated in international principles, but a lot of things are happening purely on the local level and in bottom-up processes. So we shouldn't, in a way, wait for international principles to be implemented on the local level only, but we should take into account the bottom-up forces of local actors being there and wanting to solve problems, and the guiding principles from the international level, and try to find a balance between both, right? Both are important if we think about sustainable development. A third aspect that came out is that political changes in countries can influence how local governments arrangements work, right? So here there's a picture of the Swiss parliament, actually. The Swiss political system is somehow stable, let's say. But still, the competences that you have at the local level, they influence a lot how local governance arrangements can actually deal with some of these issues. But the dynamics were much more important in Bolivia and Ecuador, where my colleagues and through their interview partners, they basically said, yes, we can plan those interactions, we can plan the cross-country interactions or the multi-sectoral stakeholder workshops and these kind of things, but we can only plan until the next election. So when government changes, everything can change. Competencies can be taken away, resources can be taken away. There's been changing dynamics of centralization and decentralization in these countries. And so the larger political context and the dynamics there are important if we want to assess what is happening on the local governance level and how these different dynamics can be taken into account. What that means is also that these arrangements are not given. They are very dynamic, and they need to be reinvented probably at times. Good. I would like to formulate, well, a couple of conclusions in a way by summarizing first that we have talked about 3 challenges of sustainability governance, right, or of governance in general. There's the challenge of cross-sectoral coordination, that different sectoral issues might have different goals and might have different logics, and ideally we find the sweet spots of synergies in between those. There's the challenge of transboundary governance, where resources are dealt with by political systems that are fragmented, but the resource is, the resources are dependent on each other. And there's the multiple levels that play a role, and where we cannot assume just a top-down implementation of these principles, right? We have seen these challenges being addressed in many ways, and they are addressed on the international level in these guiding principles. So the international actors that are responsible, or that are playing this on this scene when talking about sustainability governance, they are aware of those challenges. And we have also seen them in the local arrangements. Also there, these actors are aware that these are problematic or challenging issues, and they're working on them. Now, a couple of questions at the end, probably, of further questions that we can ask, these kind of governance arrangements that tackle cross-sectoral issues or multi-level issues or transboundary issues. What about accountability? The thing with these binational committees and the multi-sectoral plans, etc., is that they are not clearly putting the ownership of a specific problem, or they're not clearly defining who is responsible, by the very fact that problems should be addressed jointly by several countries, by several levels, by actors from several sectors. They also blur the specific responsibility of one specific actors, and it's harder to account take a specific actor to hold a specific actor accountable. And so that is an important aspect that we should think about, I think. What about participation? That is an issue that I have not really talked about. Who can actually participate in those specific governance bodies? Maybe if two countries have to coordinate the natural resource, that will happen on the government level, and so local populations or non-governmental organizations will be excluded. Maybe they're more included into national politics than into bilateral or binational politics, right? So that is an issue that we should be careful with. And the third one, we've been talking about trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goals. There's trade-offs between addressing these three challenges, right? Actors that are active in there, governments, private actors, associations, they have limited amount of resources of focusing on specific problems. And there's even literature that says if you address policies in an integrated way, for example, it's harder to take into account what is happening on multiple levels. Or if you integrate a policy across the different levels of the country, at the same time, it's harder then to also think about interactions between different sectors. So we shouldn't assume that, and actually the empirical reality in this local governance arrangement shows that, right? There's a variety, that's what I meant by institutional complexity. There's a variety of institutions that somehow tackle these different challenges. There's not this one institution, but that is probably just impossible, because a focus on one type of challenge would automatically also mean that there's less of a focus on another type of challenge. So we shouldn't wait for this wonder institution who takes into account all of these challenges and brings us further on working towards sustainability governance. Okay, I hope these things have sparked some interest and questions, and open questions. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Manuel. So now we are ready to start with the questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
Well, okay, yeah, it's on. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting and interesting lecture. Well, my question is regarding one of the quotes you got in your chapter, saying that water crisis is mainly a crisis, a crisis of governance. And I was wondering, from a historic perspective, wasn't a crisis of governance before the Rio Earth Summit? Because this lecture is, specifically referring to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And connected to this is a question about perception. So in what way does the public or global perception of water governance differ prior to the Earth Summit in comparison to now? So is there...
Can you maybe...
Yeah, of course.
It's not very clear. I don't...
shall I do it again?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No worries.
So
okay,
the first
cool.
one was about the Earth, the 1992 Earth Summit and the water crisis, but I didn't get the exact question.
Exactly. So, like, the first question is there, wasn't it a crisis of governance before '92? Because that was basically the point you were making. So, what is the difference from before to now? And then also regarding the perception of water governance on a global level, how does it differ from the past to now? And that would be basically the question. Thank you.
That's a hard question. What is certainly, I'm not sure if, it depends a bit what you call a water crisis or a governance crisis, right? I think what we probably have nowadays as compared to 30 years ago, what is much stronger nowadays is the consciousness that water resources are under pressure because of climate change mostly, right? So how that actually then plays out in terms of governance arrangements, how they differ before '92, I don't know as a general answer. What I think is important, and I mentioned that before, a lot of those local arrangements, they took into account the transboundary aspect of resources, for example, the multi-sectoral aspect of resources. They are older than the international principles. So they were funded much before '92, right? I'm not sure if they were because there was some kind of crisis, but there was certainly a consciousness on the very local level that the specific type of governance across levels or between different national administrations was needed. I'm not sure if that answers your questions, but I think on the local level, that's nothing new. Maybe the local actors can tap into some funding because they use the SDG language. Maybe because there were some resources on the national level that were given to local actors because of some international principles formulated in '92. Could happen. But I think a lot of this already started also before on the local level. And then comes this issue of centralization and decentralization, right? And these are different dynamics in different countries. In some countries you see decentralization, in some countries you see more centralization, and that influences the local coordination capacities. So, bottom line, and that's probably only half an answer, I don't see a general line of development or like the big difference between what was there before on the local level and what is there now, right? It's different context-dependent dynamics. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of local sources for addressing specific resource governance problems, right?
Thank you. I was asking myself what the role of private actors is in this water governance, for example, especially through foreign investment in some countries of the global south. I think some local communities are also more limited maybe, or like how do you see the role of private companies in this aspect?
Again, well, first, the role of private companies in the water sector in the global south, that's far away from my comfort zone as an expert, I have to say, right? Let me still say something about the role of the private sector It's probably in some of these stories of what we hear about private investments into water sources, especially in the global south, where there's often no alternative, or where the state is weak in actually exercising a control and the regulation on private investors, where societies even depend economically on private investors coming in and being active there. That is likely problematic. I don't think that we can say in general public management of water is always better than private management of water, or vice versa, right? So again, and that there's no clear answer to that, but it's again context dependent on how, on what kind of role a private company can play in water management. There's a lot of hybrid roles. But there, of course, we need to be careful on who has the power in such a hybrid role. If there's kind of a public-private partnership with water management, the question of who plays what kind of role and who has what kind of resources to actually be influential in such a situation is important. That's a very general answer in a way, right? But I've had these discussions with people that say, oh, privatization of water resources, that's bad. Water always needs to be public. Maybe not in the global south, but maybe also in the global south, but in the global north, there's quite a lot of examples where the public management of water resources is not working well. And there's examples where a private or a semi-private management of water resources might work well, right? And so it's really, I guess the question is not private or public. The question is then how such an arrangement is regulated, how it is supervised, how people can participate. And again, so it's the specific design of a governance arrangement that matters. There's not one right or wrong solution, I would say. Again, I have not really done any research on the specific problem of private investors coming into countries of the global south and privatizing water resources there. That seems highly problematic to me, but as a citizen and not as a researcher.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. It was quite interesting, especially your commentary on the synergy and trade-offs between the SDGs. And you mentioned also having certain doubt about the cleanliness of hydropower. And as a citizen of the global south, I would agree, especially because hydropower causes an absurd environmental impact.
Can you?
Is it?
It's hard. I got the first part.
Yeah. Sure. You mentioned having certain doubts about the cleanliness of hydropower. And as a citizen of the global south, I would agree, especially knowing what happened with Belo Monte and the Three Gorges Dam in China. But in a general way, would you say that the general principles of governance set by the 2030 agenda have been somewhat able in practice to help mitigate those trade-offs between SDGs, especially when caused by, for example, deficiencies in local participation in the governance process?
Again, I didn't get the audio is somehow not. Should I sit there? Is it better if I go and listen to the question down there? Okay, so it's specifically about this interaction between SDG 7 and 6.
In general, it would be about the trade-offs. If the agenda has been somewhat able to mitigate the negative effects of trade-offs between SDGs, or if it is incompatible by design somehow.
Mm-hmm. So I'm still, the audio is bad for up here. I give a general, but please ask again, right? In what I know about the interaction between 6 and 7, hydropower is the the main issue there, right? Other interactions, for example, one of the issues with Lake Geneva is also the use of water for cooling nuclear power plants, which means that you use the water for cooling nuclear power plants, but you warm up the water, which is already getting warmer, and that is destroying, basically, is attacking the ecological system of a water course, right? That could be another aspect, but I think the main part of that complicated interaction, or that the fact that we need a trade-off there, is due to hydropower, yes. But if there was a more specific question, I would need to...
Maybe I could speak like this, is it?
That could be better, yeah.
Well, I was interested in the fact that is it possible that the 2030 agenda and its principles have been able to help mitigate the trade-offs between SDGs, or is there an incompatibility by design? Is it possible that those principles can help mitigate the trade-offs?
I think there is to some degree. Oh yeah. So whether the question is whether that is an incompatibility by design to have clean energy and achieving the water SDG, or whether there's actually solutions. Now, I think what is important there is that the interaction between 6 and 7 had a lot of red color in a way, right? So a lot of trade-offs. But still, there were more interpretations or more messages of also potential synergies, right? So first, there is, of course, the question to what degree hydropower needs to be a part of clean energy sources in the future, right? There might be other clean energy sources not hydropower, and so that's one thing. Then there's another thing, there's quite some hydropower plants. You've been talking about these big projects, right? They bring a lot of energy, of course. Now, there's a lot of hydropower plants that are very small and don't add a lot of energy to our accounts. They still destroy entire ecosystems, right? So if you put a small hydropower plant into a river, the river dynamics are basically gone. And so I guess looking for, there need to be some trade-offs. But looking also at what we gain from producing hydropower in terms of just the energy that we gain versus what we actually destroy in terms of a healthy ecosystem, of a healthy aquatic ecosystem, there's probably better and worse balances there. That is not to say that these big dams should be built, I don't know, right? But that they bring a lot of energy to private investors, etc. So that's complicated, of course. But at least they bring a lot of energy, let's say. The smaller ones, they don't bring anything and they destroy a lot.
So here, thank you very much for your intervention. Last week we had a lecture on ocean governance. And I wondered, does the fact that clean water is considered a basic need and a human primary right implies specific ways of managing related policies, and if you can see differences, for instance, with ocean policies?
We've been talking about that before. Again, ocean policies are way out of my expertise. What I think, and that is mainly also a joint discussion with your colleagues before, that lead me to this answer, right? The oceans are, in a way, a common good that is very hard to manage, right? Smaller water courses, non-salt water resources, rivers, lakes, it's clearer who the stakeholders are. It's clearer who is participating, and it's within within existing political systems, right? Saltwater resources in the oceans, that's the international level. It's basically anarchy. You could argue, right? I mean, there's international negotiations, and you have to find some kind of, you could find some kind of agreement. Non-saltwater resources, freshwater, is often sometimes transboundary, but it's at least clear of who the responsible states are that are adjacent to that specific kind of, and that probably makes it easier to find a regulation.
Yeah, thank you. And my question was also, do you see it as a more, or do the international community perceives it as a more urgent topic because it is a basic need for local population, or is it at the same stage? No.
Again, I don't know what the global population thinks. That's hard to say. What is perceived as more important? If you think about like fresh water as a resource in terms of drinking water and etc., then maybe it's more directly related to our lives. But then again, if you're talking about oceans, we're talking about sea level rise. That can put under pressure entire communities and a lot of cities that are actually on the ocean. So I'm not sure which problem is more important. Actually, both are, so the health of both types of waters is directly linked to our well-being as humans, right? Which one is perceived as more important? That's hard to say, but there's very direct links to our well-being, yes, from both. I was just thinking about another example for the interaction between 6 and 7, and the synergetic one to have a kind of a positive message there, right? There's apparently quite some potential in actually taking away the energy or using the energy that from wastewater plants. So wastewater is usually warm, and there's energy sources in it, and you can basically provide, or you can produce energy from wastewater. So that would be a synergy if you improve, if you have better wastewater plants, and at the same time you produce energy. You have cleaner water and you have more energy. I'm not sure how important that is in terms of how much energy we can get there, right? But that is just one example of where you could actually find a potential positive interaction between both. And sorry, I didn't finish. Maybe there's another question there. Sorry. I was just, that just came to my mind as kind of a positive example of.
My question also regards the relationship between the SDGs, and in particular SDG 6 and SDG 13. Is it fair to say that there are not only synergies but also a strong dependency, in particular SDG 6 being dependent on SDG 13? And if so, will it still be possible to reach the goal of clean water and sanitation if we don't manage to halt global warming?
Of course, these synergies can also be interpreted the other way around, in a way, right? So if we don't do anything, so if there's synergies, that means that if we're doing something on 13, on climate change, then we're probably also doing something on 6 automatically. Now, a trade-off would mean that if we're doing something here, we're doing harm on the other side. But the synergy can also mean if we don't do anything on climate, then maybe we cannot fully achieve the goal number 6 either, right? So of course, that also, there can also be kind of a negative dependency there in a way. Now the more specific questions were on?
Just if we don't manage to tackle climate change and stop global warming, will we have to deal with a huge water catastrophe in the future, or is there still some chance to reach the goal of clean water?
That's a big question. At least on a very specific level, right? If we don't, let's say, one of the consequences of climate change, and I mentioned that with respect to the specific context of mountain countries, is that the precipitation regimes change. And one very specific example how that leads to sanitation problems is that a lot of our sanitation systems in our cities, they are not designed for huge amounts of rainwater coming down within 1 hour, like in a tropical storm, right? That did not happen, or did happen much less before in the Western European context, and now these precipitation patterns matter. So the sanitation system is designed for having more or less regular flow of wastewater into the wastewater plants, and then can be treated, and then it goes into the water. Now, if there's too little water, some of that is not working. There's not enough flow through the pipes, and things are not working. If there's too much water, basically the untreated water is flowing directly into the rivers. And so the sanitation is not working, and the ecological system of the rivers is harmed due to the changing and the more extreme precipitation patterns. That again is due to climate change. So that's just one of the connections. I'm sure there's many more. But in general, if we assume that we don't do anything on climate change, what climate change does to the water regimes puts the goals of SDG 6 again under pressure. So I would say yes or no, but your question is, so there's a clear answer, it seems to me, to your question. If we don't do anything on 13, it will have consequences on 6. If we do something there, we have a synergy, right? So that's the...
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this lecture. We already had several sessions on other green SDGs, and one gets the impression that international environmental policy is concentrating particularly on the fight against the climate crisis. And my question would be, given the fact that insufficient water supply might be the next global crisis, do we need a shift of international attention towards SDG 6? Or is it sufficient that local actors concentrate on SDG 6, maybe without labeling it SDG 6?
Okay, that's an interesting question. There's several aspects to this. On the one hand, again, I don't think we can actually afford to concentrate on one. All this question about the dependencies between the different SDGs, the logic of this agenda, it's that it's an entire agenda, and we need to work on all of them. We need to find the sweet spots for creating synergies, ideally, right? But it's not about choosing between one and the other is just not an option. It's true that the climate politics is very dominant on the international level. For example, I have colleagues working on biodiversity, and they say that's probably the worst thing that happens. These is kind of, well, they have their different perspectives, but they're basically saying the biodiversity crisis, the loss of biodiversity is much worse than what is happening on the climate side, and we don't pay attention to it. Also because some of the dependencies of these processes are much more complex than what is happening with the climate. The climate problem is somehow easy to understand, in a way, as compared to what the biodiversity crisis does. So that's one of, so yes, from their point of view, yes. Now, with respect to water, I don't know, what was also mentioned in our local case studies and in these interviews was that sustainable development whenever something is framed as sustainable development on this local arrangement, it's mostly actually about climate, right? So there's all of this is framed as climate change, adapting to climate change, mitigating climate change, and the other aspects of sustainable development are much less taken into account. So also on that level, it is very dominant. Now you could say that's probably a success in a way of the climate movement, right? Well, some would certainly not agree, but it's on the agenda. The question is now, is there something done? But it's on the agenda, on the international, as opposed to other problems. Again, saying that we need to choose one or we need to address rather one than the other, that's hard. I think we need to address this, ideally the synergies or the interdependencies between them, right? Also in terms of the resources that we have to tackle them.
Hello. I find the challenge of transboundary cooperation an interesting one, especially considering all the sometimes that between even neighbor countries you have such different governance models. Would you say that transboundary cooperation on water management works well? And would you say that there are maybe insights or good practices that other sectors could benefit from?
Two things. Transboundary cooperation on water resources has often a very specific characteristic, is that you have a situation of upstream and downstream, not with lakes, but with rivers, right? The water flows from my territory to yours, or vice versa. That clear direction of potential problems that I create, like I take away too much water, or I pollute the water, and you're bearing the consequences as a downstream state, I don't think that is as clear as that with respect to other sectors, right? There's often back and forth mechanisms. Now, whether that makes finding solutions easier or not, that's a different issue. I think if both are equally concerned, so I basically pollute the air and you have the consequences as a neighboring country and vice versa, we might have an interest in actually finding an agreement. Upstream countries or upstream territories are often seen as not the ones that are most prone to cooperation in water agreements because they don't have the consequences, right? If I take away the water, if I pollute the water, it's going down to you, that's it. Now, there's also the argument about that upstream countries have a specific responsibility for actually having clean waters. I know that that's an argument in Swiss water politics. So we're an upstream country in terms of water, right? It's all flowing into the Rhine and the Rhone, and so our responsibility as a country to also give clean water to others through these rivers, that's an argument, right? So transboundary water cooperation, at least with streams, has this particular characteristic. Now, whether that is working well or not so well, again, there's probably no general answer to that at all. It's all very context dependent. I would say, so in the examples that I showed you before, among the Swiss cantons that are also sharing, or they're both adjacent to different water streams, in most cases it's working well. What I hear from how the Rhine Conference, for example, is working, so where Switzerland and the Netherlands and Germany are discussing issues about the Rhine on a very, that's not high politics, but still, that seems to be working well. But then, obviously, in other situations, it's not working well. I mean, you can basically interpret the Israel-Palestine conflict as a water conflict about shared waters also, right? That some people are taking water away and others don't have it. So there it's certainly not working well. We have talked about the big dams. If China is putting the dams and basically taking away the water from, for example, downstream Myanmar, that's somehow, something is probably not working. It's pure power politics there, right? So again, that is very, very, very context dependent on whether transboundary water management is working or not. It's certainly not a new thing. And again, I mentioned that before. Some of these treaties are older, much older than the international principles of transboundary water management. That doesn't mean that it's working better. You can also, a conflict can also get worse over time, of course. So there's no general answer to whether that is working well, but it's a specific type of problem. To come back to what I mentioned at the beginning, this upstream, downstream logic of who is actually affected and who is potentially a polluter, I think thinking about it's simple in a stream. Also, fish are also moving up. So it's if I fish too much as a downstream country, then you might also have a problem as an upstream country. So it's not only upstream. It's not only that the upstream country is always in a better position. But thinking about that, like who is potentially polluting a resource and who then has the damage, that is probably an important basis for finding agreements. Again, you have to first agree on who is polluting and who is benefiting, right? That's another question. There's many different interpretations about that.
Okay, do we have more questions?
Last chance. Thank you so much, Manuel. So I go here. Yeah, thank you so much. I can see we challenged you a bit, and I think that's because you're an environmental governance expert working on water issues, but obviously water is also a social good. It's a human right. And as we learned now in the discussion, it's also very important for energy production, not only hydropower and renewable energies, but as you emphasized, also nuclear energy influences water systems. And this is an aspect often forgotten when we talk about nuclear energy. So thank you very much. Today we spoke, the way I planned this lecture series, I already thought about using water as a particular resource that has these different dimensions. So today we focused on environmental governance aspects of water. Next week we will focus more on social aspects of water. The lecture next week will be provided by Laila Mehta, and it will be online, not here in the lecture hall. And then in 2 weeks from now, we will talk about SDG 7 and energy issues. So we will get back to all these crucial issues mentioned in the Q&A session. But first, many thanks to you. Many thanks to all the people who helped to organize, Felix and Elisaveta. Many thanks, and this is for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for the invitation and for all those interesting questions. Very nice to see how engaged you are as an audience. That's really good.